The ballroom of the Grand Ashford Hotel had been transformed into something out of a magazine, spread towering floral arrangements, dripping with white orchids, crystal chandeliers casting their warm amber glow across tables dressed in ivory linen, and a string quartet in the corner playing something sophisticated that Daniel Carter couldn't name. He stood near the entrance, his hands folded in front of him, wearing the charcoal suit he'd bought 7 years ago for his sister's funeral. The shoulders had gone a little shiny. The jacket still fit. He'd kept himself lean from long shifts on his feet, but no amount of pressing could hide the fact that this suit belonged to a different era of his life. A time before the divorce, before the apartment with the peeling window frames, before everything that had quietly come apart. He didn't belong here, and some small, honest voice inside him had been saying so for the past 45 minutes as he drove down the highway in his 2011 Civic with the cracked dashboard and the passenger window that only rolled halfway down. He'd passed 3 Audis, a Range Rover, and a gleaming black Mercedes in the parking lot alone. All of them parked with the casual indifference of people who didn't think about fuel prices. Daniel had parked at the very back of the lot, as if trying not to be noticed even by the pavement. He almost hadn't come. For 2 weeks after the invitation arrived, a heavy cream envelope with gold foil lettering. So overstated it felt like a challenge he'd left it propped on his kitchen counter, neither opening it nor throwing it away. He told himself he was busy. He told himself he had a project due. He told himself, with increasing lack of conviction, that it would be awkward and pointless, and that no reasonable man showed up to watch his ex-wife marry someone else in a hotel that cost more per night than he made in a week. But then his daughter, Lily, had sat across from him at the breakfast table one Saturday morning, 14 years old, and trying very hard to look casual about something that clearly wasn't casual, and she'd said, "Dad, I know it's weird, but it would mean a lot to me if you were there. Mom said she invited you, and I don't want it to be a big thing. I just want everyone to be okay." He'd looked at her face, at the careful hopefulness in her eyes, and he'd said, "I'll be there." He always kept his word to Lily. That was the one thing in his life he'd never compromised on. So here he was, at the edge of a room full of strangers and acquaintances and people he used to know, holding a glass of sparkling water because he didn't feel right taking the champagne, watching the evening unfold around him with the careful stillness of a man who has learned to take up as little space as possible. The guests moved in clusters, animated and well-dressed. The women in gowns that probably cost more than Daniel's monthly rent. The men in suits that had been tailored this decade. There were people from Emily's new life, her law firm colleagues, Ryan's business associates, a pair of socialites he recognized vaguely from a charity fundraiser photo he'd once seen on a regional magazine cover. There were also a few faces from the old neighborhood, people who had known them when they were young and married and scraping by in a 2-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner. Those people looked at Daniel with a complicated mixture of recognition and discomfort, the way you look at someone who reminds you of a version of life you've moved past. He gave them small nods. Most nodded back and quickly looked away. Daniel found a spot near the far end of the room, beside a decorative column wrapped in ivy, and decided this was where he would stay for the evening. He was not going to mingle. He was not going to make a scene. He had made a promise to his daughter. And that promise had very specific parameters. Show up, be civil, leave without incident. He could do that. He'd done harder things. He picked up a small plate of appetizers from a passing tray he hadn't eaten since noon and reminded himself that a few hours was nothing. A few hours, and he would be back in his apartment, in his old flannel shirt, watching whatever game was on. He could survive a few hours. The first looks came before he'd been standing there 10 minutes. He noticed them the way you notice a change in temperature, not dramatically, just a gradual awareness that something had shifted. A woman in a red dress leaned toward the man beside her and said something behind her hand, and the man glanced at Daniel with a quick, evaluative look, the kind that tallied up the suit and the shoes and the absence of an expensive watch, and arrived at a verdict in roughly 1 second. 2 men near the bar exchanged a few words, one of them gesturing very slightly in Daniel's direction, with a champagne flute. A woman he used to know from Lily's school pickup, a woman who had always been friendly enough in the parking lot, looked right through him, as if suddenly she couldn't quite place him, which Daniel suspected was a deliberate choice, rather than a genuine failure of memory. He ate his appetizer and watched the chandeliers, and reminded himself that none of this was personal. These people didn't know him. They were making assumptions based on surfaces, and that was a very human thing to do, and it wasn't worth carrying. Still, it stung. It stung in that particular way that only public invisibility can sting. The way it seeps under the skin not as outrage but as something quieter and more corrosive, a slow draining of the feeling that you have any right to be where you are. A young waiter in a white jacket paused near Daniel with a tray of champagne flutes, and then, looking him up and down for just a fraction of a second too long, moved on, without offering him one, as if he'd made a quiet calculation about which guests counted. Daniel watched him go. He set down his empty water glass and picked up a fresh one from a nearby station. He breathed. He told himself, a few hours. Just a few hours. When Emily finally entered the room on her new husband's arm, the crowd shifted and brightened, and for a moment Daniel forgot everything because she looked genuinely happy. He'd loved her once, profoundly and completely, in the way that young people love when they haven't yet learned to protect themselves, and there was still something in him that registered her happiness as something worth acknowledging. She was radiant in a way that had nothing to do with the dress, which was certainly beautiful. She was radiant because she was in a room full of people who reflected back to her exactly the life she'd always wanted. Daniel had never been able to give her that. He knew it, and she knew it. And the ending of their marriage had been, in its own quiet way, honest about what it was. He didn't begrudge her the happiness. He begrudged, if anything, only the way that happiness had required her to frame their years together as a kind of prologue to failure, rather than a chapter in its own right. When Emily's gaze found him across the room, she paused for just a fraction of a second, long enough for Daniel to see that she'd known he would be there, had perhaps even spent a moment this morning deciding how she would handle it, and then she gave him a single short nod, the kind you give to someone you've determined to be polite toward, without warmth. He nodded back. He meant it to be simple and dignified. He thought he managed it. Then she turned away, and her husband turned with her, and Daniel stayed where he was beside his column, and breathed through the complicated silence of being successfully civil to someone who had once been the center of his world. Ryan Mitchell was not a man who entered a room so much as he colonized it. He was broad-shouldered and impeccably dressed, with the easy physical confidence of someone who had never had to wonder whether he belonged somewhere. He was 42, the founder of a mid-sized real estate development company that had made him wealthy in the efficient, accelerating way that wealth tends to make more of itself once it reaches a certain threshold. He was funny, in the practiced, slightly aggressive way that men who are used to being the most powerful person in the room tend to be funny jokes that were actually small demonstrations of dominance, phrased lightly enough that objecting to them would make you seem oversensitive. He moved through the reception, greeting people with a handshake that was slightly too firm and a laugh that was slightly too loud, and he was clearly having a spectacular time. Daniel saw Ryan clock him from across the room about 20 minutes into the reception. Ryan's gaze moved over him with the same quick assessment others had made: suit, posture, the way Daniel held himself a step back from the main current of the room, and something in his expression shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible. A small calculation, a small decision. Ryan turned to say something to the man beside him. And the man looked at Daniel too. And the man smiled, and Daniel felt a cold premonition move through him like a draft under a door. He told himself he was imagining it. He reached for another appetizer and watched the room and waited for the dinner seating to be announced so he could find a quiet corner of a table and get through the next portion of the evening without incident. He was not imagining it. 20 minutes later, Ryan made his way over to where Daniel was standing, bringing with him the warm, gravitational pull of someone who expects rooms to rearrange themselves around his presence, trailed by two of his friends and a general attention of several nearby guests who had learned to watch Ryan the way you watch someone who might at any moment do something entertaining. He extended his hand. Daniel shook it. Ryan's grip was what Daniel had expected, firm to the point of being a statement. "Daniel Carter," Ryan said, in a voice pitched to carry just slightly further than necessary for a private conversation. "Glad you made it out. Really, it means a lot that you could come." The words were correct. The tone was not. "Congratulations," Daniel said. He kept his voice level. "You know," Ryan continued, turning slightly toward his friends in a way that framed Daniel as the subject of an anecdote rather than a participant in a conversation, "I feel like I owe you, honestly, in a weird way." He smiled. "You kind of, I don't know how to put this, you softened the ground, you know?" All those years Emily spent figuring out what she actually wanted. He paused for the laugh. And the laugh came, small and social, from the people around him. "So, seriously, thank you for that." He pointed at Daniel with mock sincerity. The way a man does when he's delivering an insult, wrapped in the precise shape of a compliment. Daniel said nothing. He simply looked at Ryan with an expression that was neutral enough to be unremarkable. And Ryan, interpreting the silence as either bashfulness or inability to respond, was encouraged rather than checked. This was a pattern Daniel had seen before in school, in workplaces, in every social context, where certain men understood instinctively that they could push as far as they wanted against quiet people, because quiet people had already established that they wouldn't push back. Ryan asked him what he was driving these days. The question was a scalpel disguised as small talk, and everyone within earshot knew it. Daniel told him. Ryan nodded, with exaggerated seriousness. "That's a solid car," he said. "I think my mechanic drives one of those." He let the silence after that sentence do its own work. The dinner was announced, and Daniel found his place at a table near the back, which was fine, which was exactly what he'd expected, and the formal portion of the evening began. The toasts started. Ryan's best man delivered one that was warm and occasionally funny, and made several references to Ryan's success, as if the audience needed reminding. Emily's sister spoke briefly and sweetly, and then Emily herself stood, holding her champagne glass, and began to speak in the careful, slightly rehearsed way of someone who has thought hard about what they wanted to say, and has spent less time thinking about what effect it might have. She spoke about her life, and where it had brought her. She spoke about ambition, and about learning to believe in herself. She said that there had been years she wouldn't take back. She added quickly, as if covering a loose edge, years when she'd felt stuck, years when she'd told herself that this was simply what life was, that she'd made choices and would live inside them. She said she was grateful to everyone who had shaped her, even in difficult times. And then she said that meeting Ryan had shown her what it meant to be truly seen, truly supported, truly championed, and the way she said those words, with a particular emphasis, made it unmistakably clear that they were defined against something, defined against someone. The guests who knew the history understood. Even a few who didn't, understood. Daniel sat with his hands on the table, very still. He listened without expression. He thought about the apartment where they'd lived together. The one above the dry cleaner. The way the radiator used to bang in February, and how they'd learned to sleep through it. He thought about the 2 jobs he'd worked, the first year after Lily was born, the early morning shift at the logistics company, and the evening shift doing IT maintenance at the university, sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night, and spending every free moment he had either with his daughter or studying for the certification that eventually got him his current job. He thought about the birthday parties he'd assembled in their small backyard, the science fair projects, the long drives to swim, meets at 6 in the morning. He thought about the divorce proceedings, how he'd agreed without argument to a settlement that was fair to Emily and to Lily, even though it left him very little, because he didn't want Lily to grow up in the shadow of her parents' bitterness. He thought about all of this, without anger, and that surprised him a little. The absence of anger. Mostly he felt the particular heaviness of being erased, of having years of genuine effort quietly filed under the category of difficult times and set aside. The formal toasts concluded, and the room loosened into the after-dinner phase. The dancing not yet begun, the cake not yet cut, the evening in that comfortable open-ended territory where people move freely and conversation flows. This was when Ryan, emboldened by champagne and audience, and the general warmth of a successful event going exactly as planned, made the choice that would define the rest of the evening. He found Daniel again. He found him deliberately, crossing the room toward him with the particular purposefulness of a man who has decided to make something into entertainment. He clapped Daniel on the shoulder hard, with the flat weight of a hand that has never once worried about overstepping, and turned him toward the small orbit of people who had gathered nearby. "I want to do something," Ryan announced, loudly enough that a widening radius of guests began to orient toward them. "I want to properly acknowledge Daniel here, because honestly, I think we've been ignoring him all night, and that's not right." He turned to Daniel with an expression of exaggerated consideration. "Daniel, what do you do these days? For work?" The question was a trap dressed as courtesy. And the room knew it in the way rooms know things. Through the specific quality of quiet that descends when a social situation becomes uncomfortable. Daniel looked at Ryan steadily. "Technical work," he said. "Systems engineering." Right. Ryan nodded, as if absorbing fascinating information. Does that pay well?" "I'm just asking. I'm curious." He held up a hand in mock innocence. "No judgment. I just, different paths, right? Different definitions of success." Someone near the edges of the group made a short sound of laughter that they immediately tried to disguise as a cough. Ryan continued. "The car's still running okay? The Civic?" He glanced at the people around him. "I told him, I think my mechanic drives a Civic. Isn't that funny?" The laughter that followed was uneven, some people joining because laughter was the social reflex the moment demanded, others holding back with expressions that flickered between amusement and something less comfortable. Daniel said nothing. He had stopped talking not because he had nothing to say, but because he had calculated, with the clarity of someone who has spent years navigating situations where speaking up was the option most likely to cost him something, that speaking would give Ryan exactly what Ryan wanted: engagement, escalation, the appearance of a conflict. Instead, he stood with his hands quiet at his sides and looked at Ryan with an expression that was neither hostile nor amused nor ashamed, that was simply present. And Ryan read the blankness of it as an absence of defenses and pressed further. Because men like Ryan always press further when they think no one will stop them. "Not everyone's meant to be an entrepreneur," Ryan said, with the tone of someone offering a philosophical observation. "Some people are more, maintenance guys, right? Keep things running. There's dignity in that." The word dignity, delivered in that context, in that tone, was a kind of masterwork of condescension. The people immediately around Ryan laughed openly now. A few at the edges had gone still and expressionless in the way of people who wanted on record, at least internally, that they hadn't laughed. Daniel looked at a fixed point slightly above Ryan's shoulder and thought about Lily. He thought about her face at the breakfast table, the careful hopefulness in it. He thought, a few more hours, just a few more hours. Then Victoria Bennett stood up. She had been at a table near the front, a position that announced significance, the kind of seating reserved for guests the hosts needed to honor, and she had been, for the entire evening, conspicuously quiet, not in a withdrawn way, but in the way of someone who is paying close attention, who is gathering information, who has decided that the most effective way to engage with a room is first to understand it. Victoria was 36 years old, and the CEO of Bennett Collective, a strategy and infrastructure consulting firm she had built from a 3-person operation in a shared workspace into a company that employed 240 people across 4 cities. She was not the wealthiest person in the room, but she was almost certainly the most professionally formidable. And even people who didn't know exactly who she was registered something authoritative in her manner, the way you register it in people who have learned that power comes from precision rather than volume. She rose from her chair without hurry. She crossed the room without looking at Ryan, without acknowledging the gathering of people around him, as if the social architecture of his little performance had simply ceased to exist for her, which in some sense it had. She walked toward the small stage at the front of the room, where the microphone had been used for the toasts, and she stepped up onto it, and she took the microphone, and she tapped it once, lightly. The sound cut through the noise of the room, and people turned, and within about 4 seconds the entire ballroom was oriented toward her. Even the string quartet paused. "I wasn't planning to speak tonight," she said. Her voice was clear and unhurried, the voice of someone who never had to raise it to be heard. "But I've been sitting here watching something happen for the last couple of hours, and I've reached the point where I think it would be wrong to continue watching without saying something." She let a beat of silence settle. "I think it's time that everyone in this room understands exactly who they've been laughing at." The room was perfectly still. Ryan, still standing near Daniel, had stopped smiling. The expression on his face was recalculating, running rapidly through scenarios, trying to determine whether Victoria Bennett was about to make things better or considerably worse for him. The guests who had been laughing a moment ago now wore the particular look of people who have a suspicion they may have chosen the wrong side of something. Emily, seated at the head table, had gone very still, her champagne glass held without drinking, her eyes moving between Victoria and Daniel, with something that looked very much like the beginning of dread. Victoria looked out at the room with a kind of steady calm that Daniel would later try to describe to his sister and fail to adequately capture. "Several years ago," she said, "my company was in serious trouble. We had taken on a project, a large infrastructure contract, that went sideways in ways we hadn't adequately prepared for. I'm talking about a failure that would have cost us the company, not just money. The whole thing. I had good people working for me, smart people, people with credentials and ambition, and every advantage I could have asked for." She paused. "None of them found the solution. One person did." She looked, for the first time, directly at Daniel Carter. His name is Daniel Carter, and at the time he was a contractor on the project, not a senior partner, not a decision-maker, not someone with any particular reason to invest himself in our survival. He found the problem, and then he found the path out of it, and he walked us through it over the course of 3 weeks, while managing his regular work simultaneously. A different kind of silence had settled over the room. It was attentive in a way the earlier silence had not been, not the quiet of a room watching someone be embarrassed, but the quiet of a room realizing it has been looking at something the wrong way. "I tried to give him a bonus," Victoria continued. "A significant one. He declined it." She let that settle. "I pushed. He declined again. I asked him why, and he said, and I remember this exactly because I found it genuinely unusual, he said, 'I did what was right. That's not something I'd want to be paid extra for.'" She looked around the room. "I've hired a lot of people in my career. I've worked alongside a great many more. I have never met anyone who answered that question that way, and I have thought about that answer more times than I can count." Ryan had moved very slightly backward, a small physical retreat that was probably unconscious, the body enacting what the mind wasn't ready to acknowledge. Emily had set down her champagne glass. The woman in the red dress who had leaned and whispered something at the beginning of the evening was now looking at her hands. Victoria was not finished. "After that project, I made it my business to learn more about Daniel Carter. Because people who behave the way he behaved in a crisis are either people who got lucky once or people who are constituted a certain way. I wanted to know which kind he was." She folded her hands in front of her with the ease of someone standing at a podium she's visited many times. "What I found out was this. Daniel Carter, for the better part of 10 years, worked multiple jobs simultaneously. He passed up promotions that would have required him to travel. He structured his entire professional life around a single priority, which was being available consistently, reliably, without drama for his daughter. Not because anyone was watching, not because he was looking for recognition, because he decided that was what being a father meant, and he built his life around that decision with the same methodical commitment that other people bring to building a career or a portfolio." She looked around the room again. "There are people in this room tonight who have accomplished a great deal. I don't diminish that. But I want to ask you something." She paused, and the pause had weight in it. "How many of you have accomplished what you have accomplished and remained, in the most fundamental sense, decent, not just successful, decent?" No one answered. No one was going to answer that question out loud, which everyone in the room understood. which was perhaps itself the answer. "Daniel has been stood in this room tonight," Victoria said, more quietly now, "and treated as a punchline. And I've been watching that happen, and I've stayed quiet because I told myself it wasn't my place. But here is the thing about staying quiet when something is wrong." She looked directly at Ryan. "It becomes your place by default. Everything we allow becomes a decision we've made." She set the microphone down on its stand, with the composed finality of someone who has said exactly what she came to say, and requires nothing further from the room. The silence that followed was a different kind of creature from any silence the evening had yet produced. It wasn't the silence of embarrassment, or awkwardness, or waiting. It was the silence of recalibration. Of a room running rapidly through the past several hours, with revised information, reclassifying what it had laughed at, and why, and what that meant about the people who had laughed. Someone near the middle of the room began to clap, slowly, tentatively, the kind of applause that is half conviction and half social testing, checking whether it will be joined. It was joined. The applause moved through the room in expanding waves, accumulating, and then it was simply everywhere. And Daniel stood in the middle of it with his hands at his sides, looking at nothing in particular, his jaw held very steady. Ryan Mitchell had gone to a far corner of the room. He was holding a drink and looking at the floor, and even from across the ballroom, you could see that whatever authority he'd been radiating for the past hour had simply left him, evacuated without ceremony, leaving behind only a man at his own wedding who had badly miscalculated the room. There was nothing dramatic in his posture. No visible humiliation. Just a kind of deflation, the specific flatness of a person who expected the room to keep following his lead and found that it had made different arrangements. He would, Daniel knew, find a way to frame the evening later that protected him from what he was feeling right now. People like Ryan always did. But the evening itself was done for him. Emily came across the room toward Daniel, while the applause was still trailing off. She was moving in the unhurried way of someone who has made a decision and is committed to it, and her eyes when she reached him were bright in a way that had less to do with happiness than with the exertion of holding back something she'd been carrying all evening. "Daniel," she said, and then stopped. She tried again. "I owe you an apology. Not just for tonight. For a lot of things." She looked past him for a moment, and then back. "I think I needed to believe that the years I spent, feeling like I was going nowhere, were because of circumstances, because of choices I'd made. And it was easier to put you in that category than to understand that you were doing something I didn't have the patience to do." She shook her head. "You were never the problem. I just told myself you were, because I needed someone to be the problem." Daniel looked at her for a moment. He was aware, in some distant part of himself, that this was the conversation he'd spent years thinking he wanted, and now found that he no longer needed, that the need for it had quietly dissolved at some point, when he wasn't paying attention, replaced by something more like neutrality. The kind that isn't emptiness, but actual equilibrium. "I know," he said. "And it's okay. It was a long time ago, Emily. I hope tonight's what you wanted it to be." He said it without irony, and she seemed to understand that, because she nodded and touched his arm briefly, and then moved back toward her husband. And the gesture was neither warmth nor closure, but something simpler, two people acknowledging each other with decency. Victoria was nearby. She'd moved off the stage and was accepting the attention of several guests with the polite efficiency of someone who would rather not be talking about what she'd just done, which Daniel found characteristic even from a distance. He crossed the room toward her, and she turned as he approached, and they looked at each other for a moment, in the way of two people who have something to say and aren't sure which of them should start. "I didn't need you to do that," Daniel said. He didn't say it with resentment. He said it as a statement of fact, offered carefully, so she'd understand he meant it as information rather than criticism. "I know you didn't," she said. "I did it because I was the only person in that room who had the standing and the information to make it stop. And I decided to use them. That's all it was." She paused. "Although, for what it's worth, everything I said was true. I've told that story about the project, About what you said when I offered you the bonus to every executive team I've worked with since then. As a case study in what real professional integrity looks like. I probably should have told you that sooner. Why didn't you? He asked. She considered the question with the straightforwardness of someone who gives real answers. Because you seemed like someone who would find it embarrassing, she said. Was I wrong? He thought about it. No, he admitted. You weren't. She smiled at that, a genuine smile. Not the professional variant, and it changed her face entirely. Made her look suddenly younger and considerably less formidable, which Daniel suspected she was aware of, and deployed with precision. I'm putting together a team for a new project, she said. I've been looking for someone with your particular skill set for about 4 months. I was going to have my assistant call you next week, but since you're here, she tilted her head. Would you be willing to have a conversation? Daniel looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the drive home in the Civic, about the apartment with the peeling window frames, about Lily's face at the breakfast table on a Saturday morning, and how it looked when she was trying not to show that something mattered to her. He thought about the years of quiet work, the shifts and the sacrifices, and the particular kind of steadiness that doesn't make headlines but holds things together. He thought about standing in this room for the past 3 hours feeling like he didn't belong. And then he thought about what Victoria had said. He had belonged here all along. He simply hadn't known anyone was paying attention. Yeah, he said. I'd be willing to talk. The music had resumed. And the room was moving again. The complicated stillness of the past few minutes already beginning to soften into the ordinary rhythm of an evening winding toward its end. Daniel stayed a little longer than he'd planned. He danced exactly once, when Lily, who had been watching the whole thing from a strategic position near the dessert table, and who came to him now with shining eyes, and the barely suppressed energy of someone who has witnessed something extraordinary, and is dying to talk about it, pulled him onto the floor, and made him do a terrible waltz with her while she whispered, "Dad." That was insane. I can't believe that happened. Are you okay? And he told her he was fine. He was better than fine, and she said she stood up for you. The CEO stood up for you, as if testing whether it was real, and he said yes. And she held his arm tightly for a moment before spinning away in the way of 14-year-olds who alternate between needing their parents completely and needing them not at all. And he watched her go with the warmth in his chest that no amount of bad evenings had ever managed to touch. When he finally left, it was past 10 o'clock. He walked through the lobby of the Grand Ashford Hotel with his jacket over his arm and his steps unhurried. And the young man at the door held it open for him with a small professional smile. And Daniel thanked him and stepped out into the night air, which was cool and clean after the warm crowding of the ballroom. His car was at the back of the lot, where he'd parked it to be inconspicuous, and he walked to it without hurrying, past the Range Rover and the Audis and the gleaming Mercedes. And he unlocked it and got in and sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel and the engine not yet started, listening to the quiet. He thought about what Victoria had said. He thought about the way the room had changed when she'd spoken, not because she'd shamed anyone into better behavior, though she had done that too, but because she had made visible something that had been there all along, invisible only because no one had known to look. He had been in this room all evening. He had been the same person for all of it. The guy with the old suit and the old car and the quiet life built around his daughter. Nothing about him had changed in the 3 hours between when the first person looked through him and when the room stood up and clapped. The only thing that had changed was the information people were working with, which meant, he supposed, that what people had been judging all evening wasn't him but their own assumptions about him, their own shortcuts, their own need to rank and assess and place on a hierarchy in order to feel orientated. He had simply been what he always was. The hierarchy had gotten it wrong. He didn't feel triumphant about this. He felt something quieter than that, something that wasn't quite vindication and wasn't quite peace, but was somewhere in the territory between them. In the wide, livable country of having gotten through something difficult without losing himself. He'd kept his word to Lily. He'd kept his head. He hadn't become Ryan even for a moment, hadn't let himself be pulled into the cheap satisfaction of retaliating because he knew from experience that retaliating felt good for about 40 seconds, and then you were just a different kind of person who'd done a pointless thing. He had stayed himself all evening. That, it turned out, had been enough. More than enough. He started the car. The engine caught on the second try. It always needed a second try when the weather was cool, and he backed out of the space and drove slowly through the parking lot toward the exit. The city opened up ahead of him, streetlights and late traffic, and the ordinary world that had been carrying on all evening without any knowledge of what had happened in a hotel ballroom. He merged onto the highway and settled in, the cracked dashboard, and the half-opened window, and the faint rattle that came from somewhere in the back wheel well. All of it familiar, and honestly not worth fixing until it stopped working, because it still worked, and working was enough. The radio was on something quiet, a station he'd found by accident years ago, that played older songs without commentary. He drove. There are people who will measure a man by the car he drives. They will measure him by the cut of his suit, by the address on his license, by the logo on his watch, by which table he sits at, and whether anyone at that table is glad to see him. They will do this efficiently and without malice, because these are the metrics the world has made available, and we use the tools we have. And sometimes, measured this way, a man like Daniel Carter comes up short. He knows this. He has always known this. He made his choices with his eyes open, knowing exactly what they would cost him in the currencies that certain rooms trade in. And he made them anyway, because he had decided that other things mattered more. He had decided that being present genuinely, reliably, uncomplainingly present for a child who needed a parent was worth more than any promotion he'd passed up, any raise he hadn't negotiated for, any evening he'd spent in a company parking lot on a call with a school counselor instead of at a client dinner. He had decided this not dramatically, not with any particular sense of martyrdom, but simply as a calculation he'd run, and a conclusion he'd reached. He was at peace with the math. But it is also true, and this is the harder thing to hold, the thing that costs more to admit, that being at peace with your choices does not fully insulate you from the way other people respond to those choices, that a man can know his own worth and still feel it diminish under enough sustained contempt. That dignity is not simply something you carry in yourself, but something that requires, now and then, to be recognized by the world you live in. Daniel had spent years not requiring that. He had gotten very good at not requiring it. But somewhere in the long evening of the ballroom, he had allowed himself to feel the weight of being unseen. And it had been heavier than he'd expected, and Victoria Bennett had done something very specific by taking that microphone. She had handed back to him something he hadn't admitted, even to himself, that he needed returned. She had simply told the truth. In a room where everyone was comfortable with a particular version of him, she had offered a different version, the accurate one, and the room had responded, the way rooms respond to truth when it is delivered by someone they respect. By updating. That was all, but it was not nothing. It was, in fact, quite a lot. He would think about that for a long time afterward, the particular power of one person deciding to tell the truth in a place where the truth is inconvenient. He would think about the conversations it might inspire in him, the moments in his own life, when he had stayed quiet in rooms where speaking was uncomfortable, and what had been allowed to continue because of that silence. He would find, in those reflections, enough material to keep him honest for years. His apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like laundry, and sometimes like the Thai food from the place on the corner, and it had a view of a parking garage and 2 windows that got enough morning light to make the living room pleasant from about 8 until 10, and then ordinary the rest of the day. He parked in his usual spot and took the stairs and let himself in, and stood in the hallway for a moment, with his keys in his hand, listening to the particular quiet of a home that has only one person in it most nights. He hung his jacket on the hook by the door. He loosened his tie. He went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water and stood at the counter drinking it and thought about Victoria Bennett saying his name in that ballroom with the absolute undefended confidence of someone who knows the difference between fact and opinion and has the authority to insist on the creeps de distinction. He took out his phone and looked at the text from Lily, sent about an hour ago. "Dad, are you home yet? Tonight was a lot. Call me tomorrow. Love you." He typed back, "Home safe. Tonight was definitely something. Love you too. Sleep well. He set the phone on the counter. He looked at the water glass, the ordinary kitchen, the view of the parking garage through the window above the sink. He felt, with a clarity that surprised him a little, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not because the apartment was where he wanted to end up, not because the parking garage was a view worth keeping, not because the 2011 Civic with its cracked dashboard was the vehicle he'd have chosen if choosing had been unlimited, but because all of it was evidence of a life he had built according to what he actually valued. And it held, and it was real, and tomorrow Lily would call, and her voice would be warm and full of the energy of someone describing something she'd witnessed that she didn't have the words for yet, and he would listen, and he would laugh at the right moments, and that would be enough. It had always been enough. He had simply, for an evening, needed someone else to see it. The truth, finally, is simple. You can measure a person in all the ways the world has invented for measuring income, title, vehicle, postal code, the quality of fabric on their back. These measurements are not meaningless. They reflect real things about real conditions in a real world where resources matter. But they are incomplete measurements, and we know this, and we apply them anyway because they are convenient, and convenience is its own kind of temptation. What Victoria Bennett did in that ballroom was refuse the convenience. She used a different ruler, and what it measured, in Daniel Carter, was something the evening's other rulers had entirely missed. A man who had decided, years before anyone was watching, what kind of person he wanted to be, and had then simply gone ahead and been that person through difficult years and quiet sacrifices and long stretches of invisibility. Without requiring applause or recognition, or even acknowledgement, he had been that person in the parking lot of a school at 6 in the morning. He had been that person at 3 in the morning, with a sick child and an empty medicine cabinet and a drive to the 24-hour pharmacy in the rain. He had been that person at a company in crisis, finding a solution no one else had found, and declining the reward for it because it simply hadn't felt right to accept it. He had been, across thousands of ordinary moments no one would ever compile into any kind of record, exactly the person he intended to be. That is the story. And it does not end with him becoming wealthy or famous, or with Victoria Bennett and Daniel Carter beginning some dramatic new chapter that resolves all the earlier ones neatly. It ends with a man driving home in his old car, his daughter's text on his phone, the window cracked just enough to let in the night air, and something steady in his chest that had been temporarily rattled and was now, quietly, resettled. The world had looked at him today and gotten it wrong, and then looked again and gotten it right. And he had survived both experiences without becoming less than himself. He had walked out of that ballroom with his head level and his stride unchanged. And the parking lot had been full of expensive cars. And he had gotten into his and driven away, and the night was cool and ordinary in his. Some things cannot be bought or borrowed or faked. Some things are built only in the slow, unglamorous accumulation of choices made when no one is watching. Choices that cost something real and are made anyway, because the person making them has decided that certain things matter more than others and is willing to pay the difference. Character is one of those things. So is the particular kind of peace that comes from having nothing to hide, from knowing that the person you are in public is the same person you are in private, that you would not be embarrassed by your own reflection in any mirror, in any moment of any ordinary day. Daniel Carter knew that feeling. He had known it for a long time. Tonight had not given it to him. It had only made it visible to a room full of people who had needed, briefly and expensively, to be shown. He slept well,